Okay, welcome back. In this video, we will go over chapter number 16, the last chapter in our course, the reproductive system. Now, the reproductive systems, both for male and female, are responsible for producing and nurturing sex cells and then transporting them to the sites of fertilization. In males, these sex cells are the sperm, and in females, the sex cells are called the eggs, or also called the oocytes. Whenever you see this prefix here, OO, that's a reference to eggs. So an oocyte is just an egg cell. Now all sex cells, whether it be sperm or eggs, have one set of genetic information that has 23 chromosomes. And this is produced with a special process called meiosis. Now in a normal cell, every cell will have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. This is where that number comes from. And those are, meiosis is really just cell division, but within sex cells only. Alright, first we'll start with the male reproductive system, then we'll move on to the female's reproductive system, and then also the menstrual cycle. The primary sex organs in males are the testes, or testis for singular. And the generic term for the primary sex organ is the gonad. Now, gonad just means, in general, the primary sex organ. A male has a gonad and a female has a gonad. Everything other than those primary sex organs are considered accessories. Doesn't matter if they're found internally or externally. Doesn't matter what they do. No matter how important they are. If it's not, in males, if it's not the testes, it's considered an accessory organ. Alright, here's a sagittal view of the male. He's facing to his right. Of course, the testis down here. Penis down here. Bladder right here. The anus here. For some perspective. We'll talk about most of these terms listed on this picture. Alright, we'll start with the testis and move our way more internally. Testis is singular. Testes are plural, so referencing both. They're going to be suspended by what's called a spermatic cord. And the testes are surrounded within a sac-like pouch of tissue called the scrotum. So the spermatic cord is what enables the testes to be suspended outside of the male's body. Now each testis is divided into approximately 250 various compartments. They're called lobules. Now inside each of those lobules, inside each of those 250 compartments, a structure called the seminiferous tubules. Very highly coiled, very tightly wound tube. And each lobule has one of these tubules. And this site is where the sperm cells are actually made, in the seminiferous tubule. Alright, cells that lie on either side of these seminiferous tubules are very specialized interstitial cells. And sometimes they're called just interstitial cells, but the formal name of these are called the cells of Leydig. It is these cells of Leydig that produce testosterone and other hormones that help the sperm cells to mature. Alright, in this illustration we have one testis cut cross section, or sagittal section, so you can see more internally. Each of these here, there, those are individual compartments. And inside each of those would be the seminiferous tubules. See how coiled they are here. Okay. If you look at just one section of the seminiferous tubule really close up, you would see this. And the sperm cell is going to start off here toward the outside and kind of migrate toward the middle to where they go to mature. And these cells that are right here, these little blue dots here, are all the cells of Leydig. And this is the same thing as that second image, just with a real image, not an illustration, but a real image of a seminiferous tubules. You see, if you look toward the middle, these are sperm cells that are just beginning to be formed. And then these little black dots here are the interstitial cells, or the cells of Leydig, that would surround all of this. You can see them here, they're starting to form here and here. They're getting a little bit more larger in size as they migrate toward the middle here. Now, an even closer up view of that is this. Again, this is a real electron image of a seminiferous tubules. And you can see the tangled tails of all the sperm cells toward the middle here. So this is the same thing as this, but much greater detail. Alright, speaking of sperm cells, the process of a sperm maturing is called spermiogenesis. The suffix genesis means the beginning of, or the creation of. So this word literally breaks down into the formation or the beginning of sperm, the spermiogenesis. Each sperm cell has four basic components. You have the head, which contains the nucleus of the cell with all the 23 chromosomes. The acrosome, which is basically a little hat that fits on top of the head. And in here you'll find the enzymes that help to penetrate the egg for fertilization. Middle piece is called the midpiece, where you have a huge number of mitochondria, which allows the sperm cells to be able to swim because they need to be able to whip their tail back and forth. And of course, their last component is the tail, where you find many microtubules. Here's an illustration of one. The head right here, where you find the chromosomes, the 23 chromosomes. The midpiece here, with all the mitochondria to help whip around its tail from side to side and help it swim. And then this little hat-looking thing here would be the acrosome. If this acrosome isn't here, the sperm cells can't penetrate the egg and allow for fertilization. So the structure has to be here. This image, even though it looks like an illustration, it is real. It's just colorized so you can see more detail. But these are real sperm cells. Of course, you can see the overall the headpiece here, the acrosome from that line forward. See, the midpiece to be right about here for this one. And then, of course, you see all the tails kind of laying all over the place in this picture. Alright, those are the testes and the sperm cells. We'll get a little more internal, talk about the epididymis. It's a very, very tightly coiled tubes on top of each testis. So there's one on the right, one on the left. Each one is about 6 meters long. That's about 19.5 feet. So imagine 19.5 feet of tubing crammed down to fit on top of each testis. It's just 19 feet on one side, 19 feet on the other side. Very tightly wound, very highly coiled tubing. And this is where sperm cells go to mature. Because immature sperm cells are not motile. They can't swim or move on their own. They have to go to a place and mature first. So sperm cells are made in the seminiferous tubules, but then go to the epididymis to mature and then wait to be ejaculated out. This is how the epididymis would look in cross-section. If you look closely here where these arrows are, these are the sperm cells that are maturing right in here. Same thing down here. Okay. Alright, move on to some other structures for the male. The vas deferens is also called the ductus deferens. It's a long muscular tube. It's about 45 centimeters long. And so long because it goes from the top of the testis and wraps all the way around the bladder. Alright, going back to this image here from the very beginning, the ductus deferens or the vas deferens starts way down here at the testis and loops all the way around the bladder and then back out through the penis. So that's why it is so long, because it loops all the way back around the bladder. And each testis has one, a vas deferens, and they will extend from the epididymis to what's called the ejaculatory duct. It's this duct where all the material that will be ejaculated out kind of meets to be ejaculated outside of the body at this duct. Now, the vas deferens is also the structure that is cut during a vasectomy. That's why I refer to the structure as the vas deferens as opposed to the ductus deferens. People are more familiar with the term vasectomy versus vas deferens versus ductus deferens. And here's how that process would look. A basic illustration of before vasectomy and then after. And what's done is, you look at right here, where the cursor is, two ends of the vas deferens are cut and then cauterized or burnt off from one another. And the purpose of this is to prevent sperm cells from being ejaculated out. And if that's prevented, then you cannot get a woman pregnant. But what people don't realize is, if these ends here are not cauterized completely, these ends of the vas deferens can grow back together. So it is possible for a male to have a vasectomy, but still get a woman pregnant if this process is not done properly. So this is very delicate microsurgery. It's very commonplace, so it's not a complicated surgery, but if not done correctly, can lead to pregnancy still. Alright, next we'll move on to the seminal vesicles. There's one on either side of the vas deferens. They attach near the base of the urinary bladder. The purpose of these vesicles is to secrete a fluid that will provide the sperm cells with energy so they can have that boost of energy to be able to swim as they're ejaculated out, and hopefully to fertilize a female egg. And this fluid also will help the female reproductive organs help them cause muscle contractions to help to retain the semen that gets ejaculated inside. And of course, like everything else for the male, these contents will empty into the ejaculatory duct. Next, we'll move on to the prostate gland. It secretes a very thin, very alkaline, very basic fluid that will enhance sperm mobility. And the reason why I do this is the environment that they're stored in, the sperm cells are stored in the epididymis, tends to be slightly acidic. So you need a way to help protect those sperm cells as they enter a very acidic environment, such as the vagina. So the prostate gland creates this secretion that helps coat the sperm cells to help protect them from that acidic environment, so they can last longer, survive longer. And the ducts of this prostate gland will open into the urethra. And again, going back to this original image that we saw before, the prostate gland is right here, and you'll notice it lies just underneath the bladder. That's why if a male has some swelling of the prostate or some irritation of the prostate, they feel like they have to urinate all the time, especially if they're laying down. They feel like they have to get up and go over and over and over again, or they feel like they haven't completely voided enough urine. It's because when this gets swollen or irritated, it will irritate the bladder. That's why a common symptom of prostate issues is constant urination, or urination when you're laying down at night, or the feeling that you haven't fully gone. Alright, the next structure, commonly called the Cowper's glands, but the full name is the bulbourethral glands. These lie just inferior to the prostate gland, and these glands will help secrete a mucus-like fluid that responds to the male being sexually stimulated. And the point of this is to help lubricate the end of the penis for intercourse. So here's a posterior view of the male reproductive system. Of course, you have left and right hand sides of everything. So testis here, epididymis lays on top, the very tightly coiled tubing. See, it dips back down, it comes back up for the vas deferens. Up and around the bladder will be right up here. Seminal vesicles on either side, left and right. Prostate here. That leads into the bulb of the penis and then out of the penis. So again, 2 testes, 2 epididymis, 2 vas deferens, seminal vesicles on either side, and 1 prostate that kind of covers both. There's only 1 prostate gland, but it covers both left and right hand sides. Alright, next move on to a material called the semen. And a lot of people confuse what the semen actually is. A lot of people will use the term semen interchangeably with sperm cells, and that is very wrong. That's very incorrect. Now, the semen is the combination of everything that gets ejaculated out. So it's not only the sperm cells, but also the secretions of the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands. So it's everything that comes out is semen, not just the sperm cells, even though they are a critical component of semen, but it's everything that comes out. And the volume of semen can vary greatly from male, depending on their overall health and their overall age. It can be anywhere between 2 to 5 milliliters, and can contain anywhere between 40 million and 600 million sperm cells. It just depends on that male's health. Alright, all those were the internal structures. We'll talk about the external structures. We'll start first with one we've talked about briefly already, the scrotum. This is the pouch of skin and subcutaneous tissue that helps to house the testes. Also will house the testes and each epididymis. In this scrotum, you'll find a structure called the dartos muscle. Now, this is a smooth muscle that will contract and relax in order to help regulate the temperature of the testes. You don't want them to getting too hot. You don't want them to get too cold. That's why if the male's body is cold, the dartos muscle will contract to pull the testes closer to the body to keep it warm. If the body gets too hot, they will relax to cause the testes to distend a little bit further from the body, so they don't get too warm. In order for sperm cells to be healthy, they need to be kept at a very particular temperature. If they get too hot, they will die. If they get too cold, they will die. So this has to be regulated very tightly, either moving the testes up or moving the testes down, depending on that male's environment at that time. And of course, we can't talk about the reproductive system with the males without talking about the penis. We mentioned before in the previous chapter that the penis will convey both urine for the urinary system and also semen. So it has a dual function for males. The penis has some very specialized spongy tissue called erectile tissue. And there are 3 columns of this. This is what will help it become erect as it becomes filled with blood. At the very end of the penis, the enlargement at the end of the penis, is called the glans penis. And this is the area that's covered by the foreskin. And the foreskin's proper name is called the prepuce. And this is what is removed during a circumcision. So if you were to look close up at the end of a penis here, this structure here will be the very end of the foreskin, the prepuce. So if we were to peel back multiple layers here and look internally into the penis, if you were to cut it in cross section, this is what you would see. The blood vessels on top, some nerves here, the 3 columns of erectile tissue, and each one has their own particular name. We won't get into that detail, but there are 3 columns of erectile tissue. Of course, the very end of the penis will be the glans penis. And here on this slide is a summary of all the major structures that we just talked about, along with their major function. So this is a good resource for those of you that like to make note cards. All the structures here, and of course all the functions here, all in one location. Alright, that was it for the male. Now we'll talk about the female reproductive system. Of course, the female reproductive organs are specialized to make oocytes, or egg cells, and also to provide a favorable environment for the development of that offspring, and to produce sex hormones. Like we mentioned before, the term gonad is a generic term. For males, the gonads are the testes, and everything else, no matter what it does, is considered an accessory structure. For females, the primary sex organ, or the gonad, are the ovaries. So anything else that's not the ovary, no matter what it is, no matter what it does, whether it be internal or external, are considered accessories. Even though all these parts have very important roles, if it's not the testes or it's not the ovaries, they're considered an accessory organ. Just like we have with the male, we have a profile view internally of a female facing to her right. You have the opening to the vagina here, vaginal orifice. It continues all the way down where it meets the cervix. Here's the uterus where baby will develop. Just below that is the bladder. That's why for anyone who has been pregnant, especially as you get later on in the pregnancy, you feel like you have to go to the bathroom all the time, because as the baby gets bigger here, it's putting more and more pressure on the bladder here. Alright, we'll start first with the ovaries. The 2 ovaries, both right and left, are going to be oval in shape and fairly solid structures that lie on either side of the lateral wall and pelvic cavity. There are a large number of ligaments that can hold these 2 structures in place, but we'll just mention just a few of them. The largest one is called the broad ligament. It kind of drapes all the way across the pelvic cavity, from end to end. The suspensory ligament is what holds the ovary from its upper end, like you're suspending it like a chandelier, so it is being suspended from the top by the suspensory ligament. And the ovarian ligament will hold it from its lower end. Of course, there are a lot more than these 3, but these are the 3 main ones that we will discuss. Alright, here's an image just focusing on just the ovaries and the ligaments we mentioned. Which is broad ligament. It goes all the way from this side of the pelvis all the way to this side of the pelvis. That is one ovary here. That's another ovary here. The suspensory ligament holds it from the top. It actually is suspending it from the top. Then what holds it on the bottom is the ovarian ligament here. Goes all the way across here, both left and right. The ovaries can be divided in 2 distinct regions, the inner medulla and the outer cortex. Remember, the terms medulla and cortex are not particular for any structure. They are generic terms. Cortex always means the outermost part, and the medulla always means the inner part or the middle part. And we saw this with the kidneys, for example. Now, the medulla is what will contain all the lymphatic vessels, the nerve fibers, blood vessels. But the cortex is what we'll focus mostly on for this chapter. Is where you'll find the more compact tissue, and you also find the ovarian follicles, which will give the cortex a very grainy or granular appearance. Alright, just before birth, a female's eggs will go through many stages of development as the female fetus is developing. A very immature egg is called a primary oocyte. Primary means first. The oocyte, egg cell, so the very first. Now, each of these primary oocytes is surrounded by a layer of very specialized epithelial cells. So this combination of that primary oocyte plus those epithelial cells, that combination together is called the primordial follicle. Now, development of these primary oocytes will stop just before a female baby is born, and it's basically put on pause until that girl goes through puberty. Age 12, 13, 14, it just depends on that particular female. Development will basically stop just before the baby's born and not really do anything until 12 years or more later. And one thing that people don't tend to realize, a male can make sperm cells throughout most of their adult life, well into their 60s and 70s. But for females, females are born with all the eggs that they will ever have. So there's no way to increase that number. So once you start going through puberty, and when you're having your period once a month, you're losing one egg each month. Basically, this is why the older you are when you get pregnant, especially if it's your first pregnancy, the higher the risk of having a birth defect or a genetic mutation is, because basically the eggs are starting to go bad because they've been sitting there for a long time. All right, speaking of egg cells, we'll talk about that process, oogenesis. It's like with the male, genesis always means the formation or the beginning of, and oo is reference to eggs, so literally broken down the formation of or the beginning of egg cells. Now, starting at puberty, some primary oocytes will continue the process of meiosis and will further on their development. Now, when a primary oocyte divides, you would think they would go 50% this way, 50% that way, a nice even split. Well, that's not the case when it comes to meiosis for females. When you have that primary oocyte dividing, you get a very unequal distribution of cytoplasm. Instead of being 50-50, you may get 80-20 or 75-25. There's a very large difference. So what's formed is a very large secondary oocyte and a smaller polar body. Now, it's the secondary oocyte is what will become the egg or the ovum that is capable of being fertilized by the sperm cell. This is what is released each month when a woman has her period, is a secondary oocyte. Now, that secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis too if it is fertilized, resulting in a second polar body and also the zygote, or the fertilized egg. So the zygote is how we all start off as, the fertilized egg. We all start off as one single cell. When a sperm cell meets an egg cell, that is the zygote. From there, that one cell becomes 2, and then 4, 8, 16, and so on. So after fertilization, a woman will have one egg cell and then 3 polar bodies. And here's a quick comparison of meiosis between males and females. If you remember from general biology, the end product of meiosis, you'll have 4 daughter cells produced. So for males, you have 4 functioning sperm cells, but for females, you get 1 egg cell, 1 ovum, and 3 polar bodies. And these polar bodies don't really have a major function. They secrete some hormones, but then they quickly break down. All right, here's a image of a secondary oocyte and the polar body being created. You can see the large difference in size. So that would be the secondary oocyte here. That's the polar body listed here. Not an equal distribution of cytoplasm at all. Very small and then quite large. Next, we'll talk about the maturing of the follicle. See, at puberty, the anterior pituitary will secrete the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, that we talked about earlier in the course. This is what will cause ovaries to get larger. So the name tells you what that hormone is doing. Follicle stimulating hormone. It is stimulating the follicles. And during each reproductive cycle that a female has, some primordial follicles will mature into primary follicles, and those primary follicles will mature into secondary follicles. And the full maturation of a follicle takes between 10 to 14 days. And at this point, it's called the Graafian follicle. So it is this follicle that will eject out the secondary oocyte. This is the follicle that's being broken down each month during a woman's cycle. All right, here's a real histological slide of one. See the secondary oocyte here. And don't worry about what the theca interna is, or the antrum, or these other terms. But this whole thing would be the Graafian follicle. What basically happens is the pressure in here, in this fluid, will build up and eject out the secondary oocyte. That's what a ovulation is. Leading up to that, or following up on that, the process of ovulation will release the secondary oocyte. Now this is caused by a very large increase, a very large spike in the hormone LH, luteinizing hormone, from the anterior pituitary. And what happens here is the very large increase, the very sudden increase of LH causes the follicle walls to swell and to weaken. So think of filling up a water balloon. You can only fill it up so much before the walls rupture and tear apart. It's the same basic thing is happening here to the follicle. It increases so fast and gets so weak, it just ruptures apart. And the secondary oocyte is actually ejected out of the follicle, ejected toward the nearby fallopian tubes. Now, for the longest time, people thought that this process happened very quickly, very violently, like taking a cork out of a champagne bottle, where it comes out with a lot of force and pretty rapidly. But actually, the exact opposite is true. This actually takes about 15 to 20 minutes for this process to happen. And here's how it actually looks. This is a real image of a real ovulation. You have the follicle here, and the secondary oocyte being ejected out here. So this is how it literally looks. This is what a woman goes through every month, this process here, this being ejected out. This will travel on toward the fallopian tube. Here's a quick timeline of how all this works. The primordial follicles here, developing into primary follicles, and primary oocyte over here. This is the picture that we saw earlier, the oocyte here, and the fluid building up, that antrum filling up. When that large increase of LH happens, it will swell and the walls get weakened, and the oocyte is ejected out. And this will travel on toward the fallopian tube. That process we'll talk about next. Then what's left over of the follicle will secrete various hormones, but will quickly break down and become non-functional. So this process right here, the ovulation, the follicle, or the secondary oocyte being ejected out, is what's happening here. Next we'll move on to the fallopian tubes, also called the uterine tubes or the oviducts. Any of those terms are correct for the structure. I prefer the fallopian tube as the more common name for the structure. It will expand near the ovary to help collect the secondary oocyte that gets ejected out. And the structure is called a infundibulum. It looks like an upside down funnel. And on the edges of these, at the edge of the infundibulum, are finger-like extensions called fimbriae. And these fimbriae are what are responsible for sweeping up the secondary oocyte to be kind of guided toward the inside of the fallopian tube. And it's important because the fallopian tube is where fertilization actually occurs. Not inside the uterus, but in the fallopian tube. This image here is the same thing as this, but just closer up. Again, you have left and right. This happens on either side, or happens on both sides. The secondary oocyte gets ejected out. This whole thing is the fallopian tube. The upside down funnel part at the very end, infundibulum, and these extensions, the fimbriae. These will act like a broom and sweep up this oocyte so it can travel down the infundibulum and then down inside the fallopian tube. And fertilization will usually happen right about here where the cursor is. And if fertilization happens, then it will move on toward the uterus to develop into a embryo and then a fetus. But fertilization will happen usually right about here. And speaking of the uterus, uterus is of course, very muscular and hollow organ. It's kind of shaped, kind of like a pear. It's what will receive the embryo and help to sustain it throughout its development. The various parts of the uterus. The upper 2/3 is called the body. That composes of the fundus and body, but collectively known just as the body. And the lower third is called the cervix. It's the cervix that will kind of inject its way into the back part of the vagina. And the uterus has 3 layers of tissue. Endometrium, the innermost lining, because endo means inside. Myometrium, the muscular part. Perimetrium, the tissue that goes around the uterus. Of course, we can't talk about this chapter and about the female reproductive system without talking about the vagina. Fibromuscular tube that will convey uterine secretions and also receive the penis for intercourse, and also serve as the birth canal for the fetus during labor. And the opening to the vagina is partially enclosed by a thin membrane called the hymen. Move on to other external accessory organs. The actual labia, and the names majora or minora indicate the size of the structures. Sometimes you'll see them listed as majoris or minoris, but it's the same basic principle. Major means larger, minor means smaller. So the labia majora. Labia means lips, so these are the rounded folds of adipose tissue and skin. This helps form a very rounded elevation just over the pubic bone called the mons pubis. That breaks down into the mountain on the pubic bone. So it's mons pubis. The labia minora. These are the flattened longitudinal folds between the labia majora. This is what will form the clitoral hood, or the covering just around the clitoris. The clitoris is found between the labia minora, both the left and right side, where they kind of meet together. They form the clitoral hood. This will correspond to the male penis. It's going to be very richly supplied in nerve fibers. As we develop in utero, what remains the clitoris in females will become the penis in males. What remains the ovaries for females will become the testes for males. So these parts are all analogous to each other. We all start off as female, but if testosterone is present in the embryo as it develops, some parts are changed into something else to become male. That's why the clitoris will correspond to the male penis. Next, move on to the vestibule. A vestibule is always a reference to a space between structures. So this is the space between the labia minora that will include both of the opening to the vagina and the opening to the urethra. And this will secrete mucus into the vestibule during sexual intercourse to help lubricate the area. The mons pubis, this rounded mass of fat tissue here on top of the pubic bone. Labium majus or labia majoris, same thing. These larger folds of tissue here on the outer side here. The thinner, flatter folds, labia minora, these here and here, and they meet here at the top, right around the, or form the hood of the clitoris, and the clitoris is right here on top, where the minora meet. Opening to the urethra here, opening to the vagina here, and then this whole space in between these structures is the vestibule. So it includes the urethral opening and the vaginal opening. So that's the whole space in between here. And it's like we have with the male structures, a chart that has all the structures that we just talked about with their primary function. So another good resource for those that like to make note cards, because it has everything we just talked about and their functions all on one location. All right, we'll end this chapter talking about the female reproductive cycle. This is characterized by which should be a regular reoccurring changes in the endometrium. And this is what will lead to each month what's called the menstrual bleeding or the menses. That's the formal name for the bleeding. And of course, this will begin around age 13, but of course that will vary greatly on each female. Some women go through puberty before then, sometimes they go through puberty after. It just depends. And this cycle will continue whenever you reach menopause, whenever you stop menstruating. It can be anywhere between your 40s or your 50s or your 60s. It just depends on each particular woman. Now, your first reproductive cycle has a very unique name, and it's called the menarche. So that is highlighting your very first menstrual cycle, or your first reproductive cycle, as you are starting puberty. After you have ovulation on day number 14, approximately day 14, the hormone progesterone is what will cause the endometrium to become much thicker and become more favorable to an embryo, just in case that you are able to get pregnant. You have high levels of estrogen and progesterone that will inhibit the secretions of LH and FSH. And the reason why this is, if you are to become pregnant, you don't want to keep ovulating. You don't want 2 secondary oocytes to become pregnant. You don't want to have more ovulations. You want to just limit it to just 1. And like we mentioned before, after ovulation, the remains of that grafting follicle will quickly break down and become non-functional after a day or so. Alright, during the cycle, you have the levels of estrogen and progesterone will fall very sharply, very quickly. And this will lead to the blood vessels in the endometrium to constrict. And when that happens, the tissue is losing its supply of oxygen. When any tissue loses oxygen supply, it will start to die. When that tissue dies, it will start to slough off. And that's what is causing your bleeding each month in your menses. You are losing the innermost lining of the uterus, the endometrium. That layer that got thickened just in case you got pregnant to welcome that developing embryo. But if you don't get pregnant, that tissue will lose oxygen supply and then die, and then that's what you are bleeding off each month. And of course, as the woman gets older, the cycles will get less and less regular. Instead of being once a month, they may be once every 6 weeks or once every 2 months. They become very erratic, and at some point they will stop completely. That point is called menopause. Or at this point, you cannot become pregnant at all. There's no hormonal support to allow you to get pregnant. All right, on here you have charts that describe 4 different aspects of the menstrual cycle. You have levels of LH and FSH here, what's going on with the follicle here, the levels of estrogen and progesterone here, and then the relative thickening and bleeding of the endometrium. So here on day 14, that large spike in LH is what will cause the ovulation and that ejection of the secondary oocyte. And as that level starts to drop off very quickly, and what's left here will just kind of die off. Progesterone will start to decrease, and as progesterone will increase here, as you just had ovulation, the body is preparing to welcome a fertilized egg, just in case. That's why the endometrium gets much thicker here. But if pregnancy doesn't happen, and the zygote does not implant inside the uterine wall, that tissue will lose oxygen and start to bleed, and then die off, which is what happens here. And the cycle repeats itself over and over and over again every month. Now, earlier we mentioned a form of birth control for males, the vasectomy. Well, in females, there is a corresponding procedure, and it's called tubal ligation. To ligate something means to tie off. So you are literally tying off the fallopian tubes. It's the same basic process as the vasectomy. The fallopian tube is pulled out and then cut, and then the ends are burnt off and cauterized. So if an egg is fertilized, it can't reach the inside of the uterus to implant and develop. So it's the same process as here for the males. The sperm cells can't get from here to here because the path is cut off. Same thing for females. You are ligating the fallopian tube. So even if you do get an egg, gets all the way through here, it can't go any further. But just like in males, if this process is not done completely, if the ends are not cauterized completely, they can grow back together. It is possible to get a tubal ligation and still become pregnant if the process is not done properly. So these are not 100% effective for male or female. They are very, very highly effective, but they are not 100% effective. All right, that brings us to the end of this chapter, chapter 16, and to the end of the course. And like always, if you have any questions on this chapter, please feel free to contact me.